Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jo Pedinti. I'm currently the Director for Digital Health Advisory Services here at HealthXL. Before we begin, a quick note, the meeting today is recorded. We will kick off the meeting shortly with a presentation from Robert, followed by an interactive discussion. As we progress, please feel free to post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section below. Our topic for today is how to get funding for a digital health solution. The startup ecosystem in general seems to be going through significant changes recently. Capital has turned expensive and investors more demanding. A few years ago, getting investors to fund digital health companies was much easier. Market was smaller. It was not as competitive as it is now, especially in therapeutic areas like mental health. To answer these important questions about the digital health market, I would like to invite Robert to share a quick intro about himself and maybe for the next 10, 12 minutes, take us through the insights on the digital health market's evolution and what startups need to do to get funding for their solution. So Robert, off to you.
Thanks, Joe, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. My name's Robert Garber, and I'm a partner at Seven Wire Ventures based in Chicago, where I spend all of my time investing in early stage digital health companies with a particular focus on those that empower people to be consumers instead of patients by working with the enterprise stakeholders, so insurers, providers, employers, pharma companies, et cetera, but really with this idea of how do we put tools, technology, information in the hands of us so that we can be better stewards of our health and care. So I want to take maybe the first 5 or 10 minutes and just try and set the scene. I'll pull up a couple of slides. I prefer most of this to be interactive, but as Joe indicated, the universe has changed a bit over the last 60 days or so and continues to be pretty fluid. And so, what did look potentially fundable, 6-12 months ago may look very different today. And let me be clear. I don't want this to appear like it's too much doom and gloom. There is a fair amount of doom and gloom right now, but there's still plenty of capital and plenty of need. And I don't want to present the perspective that we've solved problems in healthcare, right? We've had tremendous amount of companies that have been funded over the last couple of years, and yet healthcare costs are still going up. People are still suffering. Chronic disease rates have not declined. Mental health is at an all-time high, mental health problems. And so we have a lot of work to do. And so I don't want you to be discouraged by the change in the environment from doing the important work, which is creating companies and solving problems. So just a couple of points here. So just to put this into some concrete numbers, at least in the last quarter, the last couple of quarters, we've seen about a 40% decrease in how public digital health companies have performed. And so the public markets are down between 15 and 40%, depending upon the sector you're in. So digital health is sort of at the worst end of that. And so obviously that has a trickle-down effect on private companies, such as the ones that are on here today. And that's also led to multiple compression. So the impact is not just availability of capital, but the valuation at which that capital has been raised. For those companies here that haven't raised before or raised small amount of money, that will probably be a good thing for you. For those who have raised a lot of money at much higher prices, you'll have to make sure that the fundamentals of the business support that valuation going forward. And so we've seen also a resulting decrease in just the size of rounds. And so fewer of these 100 million plus deals that are happening that we saw last year, and also an overall decrease in the number of companies that are getting funded. So that said, the numbers are still high. So these are relative metrics. And so as you can see here, it's still a lot of companies across the entire sector. From quarter to quarter, it's just declining a little bit. So what does that mean? That means we're back to fundamentals, right? We're back to the building blocks of building good companies that create intrinsic value and solve big problems. And that the story, the hype, the promise needs to be backed up with the fundamentals. So what do I mean by fundamentals? Well, back to the old, we say you got to have the metrics, you got to have the team, you have to have the dream or the mission, and you've got to be in a big market. And you've got to combine all of those to tell a story around why you deserve funding. And so when people, I was just I'm in San Diego, and I was on a panel yesterday, and we had a whole discussion about sort of what are people looking for today. And, you know, these 5 things are not unique to us or unique to this time frame, but they may be unique to some investors who have been, let's say, less focused or less disciplined over the last couple of years, and now we're going back to some of the core components of building a company from the ground up. And so we'll share these slides afterwards, so I don't want to belabor the points here, but obviously, you know, we need to have mission-driven founders who have the drive, the grit, the perseverance to build companies. Most investors want to work with people that are coachable and that recognize that they know what they don't know. I've always said, you know, this is my 25th year of being an early stage investor. Like, the one of the most dangerous things is having founders and CEOs who don't know what they don't know. I'll be the first to admit what I don't know, which is quite a bit, but the sense of infallibility in a CEO can be the downfall. And then some of the basic metrics that you guys are going to focus on, addressable market sizes, and really understanding the difference between TAM, SAM, and SUM, and sort of the idea that you don't just get to create a slide that says it's such a huge, you know, quadrillion-dollar market because of your product, but you have to really look at how many of the people within that given market at a really granular level can you address. And then it's all about metrics, right? And so I put a couple here around sales and revenue, but I want to really focus on the one on the right, which is unit economics, which is really understanding what are the economic drivers of your business, right? What are the things that you need to focus on that is going to prove to an investor that this is a fundable business, but also a scalable one, right? And that, as we say back in the good old days, you know, like, you're not selling $1 for 90 cents and making it up on volume, right? It's hard to make a business out of that. So the metrics matter. And there's some more detail on sort of what are some of the metrics among each category that I won't go through. But again, like, this particular slide always resonates for me, sort of understanding what's the cost to acquire a customer, what's the value of that customer for as long as you have it, and what's the margin profile of it. And then how does that change or improve over time? And these are pretty good barometers of whether A, your business will scale, and B, do you understand your business and what really drives it? And then the other component of metrics are obviously ROI, outcomes, and financial performance. And so these are just some of the ones that we see across different businesses that are areas for you to focus on. And I want to highlight, it's important not to have 20 metrics, right? It shows that just shows you're throwing spaghetti against the wall. You really need to understand what are the 3, 4, 5 things that really drive the business and focus on those. And I would encourage you to, at least somewhere in those 3 or 4 or 5, to really make sure that you're demonstrating financial ROI, because in a tight market like this, that's going to really matter to both your customers and to your investors. So the last thing I wanted to say here, and then we can stop the slides and I'll let Joe take over, is I think it's important for you to be deliberate in your fundraising, right? It's never good to be focused, never good to do what I call the accidental raise, which is you take an inbound call. It seems kind of interesting. You weren't really planning to take money. And unless it's a preemptive offer with a really attractive investor at a high price, suddenly you like slide backwards into the fundraising process, and you don't have a data room, you don't have a good story down, you don't have your financial model fully baked, and you end up sort of playing, you know, this sort of game of whack-a-mole. You're always trying to respond to different investors' requests. You don't have the information in your hands. You end up looking unprepared and unprofessional, and it can be really bad for the company and bad for your fundraising. So I think it's really important for you to put together a process. Make sure you have all your information locked down before you do it, especially in this market, so that you can be really responsive. One of the things that I know frustrates investors is that we express a lot of interest, and then a company goes silent for 2 weeks while they prepare materials that we request. You know, we have so many things competing for our attention that it's very hard for us to sort of re-engage once we've lost momentum. So that's 10 minutes. I'll stop this. Again, they can share additional these slides after we're done, but I think it's important if we have a dialogue about this.
Thanks, Robert.
Sure.
So Before we get into the startup side of things, maybe we can understand the investor side of things. So when investors decide, how do they decide their focus areas, which areas they invest in, et cetera?
For most firms, I would say it's driven by two things: either one, thesis, or two, core areas of expertise. For us, it's thesis, right? We have this deep thesis around the emerging role of the consumer in healthcare, and our belief that if we don't empower the consumer earlier in their life cycle, we're never going to get in front of all the expensive medical issues that people have. However, you go and talk to somebody who invests in life science companies who have PhDs and physicians on their team, they're very rooted in science. And so they're going to say, all right, we're building our portfolio around therapeutics, for example. So I think a lot of it's driven by team experience or thesis. And then I said the last thing is, if for the team like we are, who came out of operating roles, we lean on that experience a lot when we think about adding value. And so for us, coming out of operating roles in healthcare, it'd be very strange for us to say, okay, we're going to go do, tech deals and direct to consumer, just fall outside of our areas of value add. And so I think the other component is sort of like, where's your network? Where's your expertise? Where can you add value as an investor? It's going to drive sort of areas of focus.
That's great. So when it comes to startups, what should their first slide deck be? Should it be as elaborate as possible? Should it be a one-pager? Does it matter?
It does matter. I think, 10, 12 slides. And I believe in my slides, I sort of talk a little bit about it, but when I first learned the business about 25 years ago, I saw a presentation by someone at NEA, which is one of the biggest firms in the US, and they talked about the 5 M's. And I always forget what the fifth one is, but it was basically the management team, the method, which is what are you doing, the metrics, and the market. And there's a fifth one, and I apologize, I never remember it, but it's like cover the basics, right? Who are you? What's the problem you solve? Why should I care? And why are you going to win? Right? I mean, it sounds, and be concise. Like if you can't explain that in 10 or 12 slides, then you need to go back and refine and refine and refine. It's easy to tell a story, or easier to tell a story in 30 or 40 or 50 slides than to tell it in 10. But I think you need to really make sure that you get your story down, crisp, concise. Because I tell you, I walk out of pitches all the time, not really understanding what people do or why they're doing it, which I think is kind of an interesting phenomena, given the fact that if you can't tell the story to me, then how are you going to tell the story to a customer? How are you going to tell the story to an employee, potential employee? I mean, you need that whole story to build a business with all the different stakeholders you have to sort of coordinate.
I think that also probably shows clarity of vision in how they probably make it easy and concise. So the way I see it from your answer, I think it's to keep it simple, to keep it concise, and make sure that you're covering all the bases in terms of the 5 M's. 4 we've figured out, 5 probably we will email the team.
If I find the fifth one, I'll email it. I just think people need to understand also, like the question is like, why do I care and why are you going to win? Is more important than ever now. Differentiation is going to be really important in this market cycle. Okay. And there's so much noise and there's so many companies, and there's somehow you need to figure out a way to stand out, right? And you need to be addressing big markets with interesting solutions. And that sounds easy, but it's hard.
To that point, any advice, given that the market is definitely getting crowded with the number of digital health solutions, any advice on how they can stand out when it comes to investors in general?
Honestly, I think it's about doing your homework. I know that sounds sort of trite, but we're doing our homework too. So as market cycles change, we're spending lots of time with buyers, so payers, providers, employers, pharma, trying to understand what are the problems they're still having. One of the things that we've seen right now is, my analogy that I've started using lately is like the whole market has sort of been eating at the buffet for the last few years, gorging themselves. And now they're taking a pause and saying, okay, so we implemented all these different solutions in a very short period of time. And that was all accelerated because of COVID, for sure. Now they're going through this assessment, like, what do we have? What do we still need? what's actually having impact and how do we measure that impact and what's missing. And so I do think it's important before entrepreneurs go to market and try and fundraise is to validate their hypotheses about product market fit, is to go and talk to customers and say, if we did this, do you care and would you buy it? Like, does this solve a problem for you? Because I think that the answers to those questions have changed in the last quarter, right? I think that what we're finding out is a lot of buyers bought things without thinking really hard about the ROI. And they've got a lot of solutions that they've implemented that are getting low engagement, low utilization. And so coming to me with another solution that looks like the ones that are already out there that are not getting a lot of utilization or engagement, it's hard for us to get our arms around that. So I think step one is, validate with your customers that what you're doing is something that's a priority for them. And if it's not on their list of, top 5 priorities, it's probably going to be a real challenge right now to get the buyers' attention. And the first thing we're going to do, by the way, in diligence is call our network contacts in the market and say, is this a problem for you? Do you need such a solution? Where is this on your list of projects in your strategic roadmap for 2022 or 2023? Like, we're going to do that work ourselves. So help us by doing it yourself before you come to us.
I think you also have a very good point in terms of if there are similar solutions that are facing some significant challenges. If you have figured out an answer, that might be a good differentiator. So understanding the market, understanding the challenges, and prepared for it is probably always good to have. There's an interesting question from the audience. Given the suboptimal performance of the recent tranche of digital health SPACs, what are you seeing today as the exit plan for early stage startups you're investing in? Is it mostly acquisition?
Yeah, we're a little untraditional in how we view exit. I would say our fundamental core belief is back strong founders who are building businesses that create compelling asset value and solve big problems, and the market takes care of itself, right? So like, we never go into a company and say, well, we're going to flip it to so-and-so, we're going to take this public. We actually go in, and our perspective is can we build a big, meaningful business with strong fundamental financial performance that solves big problems? I think, and good companies, for the most part, are bought, not sold. And by that, I mean, like, you get inbound interest when you build a good asset, and the exit kind of takes care of itself. Right now, from an exit perspective, like, there's a lot of M&A, but it's going to be largely opportunistic and consolidation driven from companies that are not doing well. The IPO markets are closed, the SPAC markets are gone. And so, this is a cycle. I can't really do anything. My perspective is I can't really do anything about these exogenous factors that are going on in the marketplace. What I can do is be patient, disciplined, around valuation, around capital efficiency, and try and build good companies, knowing that the market cycle will come back. So I'm less exit focused right now and more focused on sort of the building part. And honestly, in these cycles like this, it's a great time to start businesses, to get businesses funded. I mean, I'm a big believer that these cycles are inherently good for creating, and some of the best returns for investors have come out of companies started during down cycles, or historically over the last 50 years.
When I went through your slide, I think there was a detail about alternative funding. Given the current market situation, are there fundings that you would recommend over others? What are some of the different types of fundings?
I mean, look, I think the more creative entrepreneurs can be, the better. I mean, ones that come to mind are sort of research grants, non-dilutive funding. So whether it be government or private foundations or academic institutions that are funding research, we're seeing some of our companies leverage venture debt to extend runway. So it can be done more quickly with sort of less headache if you have at least some cash still in the bank. We're seeing some companies going the strategic route. So approaching strategic partners for which this is really, really valuable and saying, join us as an investor or a co-developer on a given project or product. And lastly, then we're seeing like sort of like some just creative structural things like on contracts. Like when you contract with a big customer, can you get some upfront payments or progress payments? Because many of them pay slowly. And so, it's great to have revenue, but cash is what ultimately keeps the lights on. And so think creatively around your contracting and figuring out how can you get cash earlier from some of your big partners to help fund your development. So I've seen a lot of those different sort of approaches, and I encourage people to be really creative about it. All of those, combined can be material, even if not a single one of them is material in and of itself.
On the topic of funding, there are so many accelerators, incubators from pharma, from others. Any thoughts being a part of the accelerator incubator? Is it good to have that as a part of the pitch? Any investor thoughts on being a part of accelerator incubators?
I think inherently it's probably a good thing. I don't prioritize or deprioritize businesses based on their participation in accelerators. I think what's more important is what's the impact of the accelerator. From a company perspective, I would look at it and say, it's not a fundraising discussion. This is a business decision, right? Does the accelerator help me refine my product? Does it get me in front of customers? Does it get me in front of investors? Does it help me tell a better story and answer some of the questions that I need answers to raise capital? And in a market cycle like this, going and putting heads down somewhere for 3 or 6 months in accelerator is not a bad thing to do if it's the right accelerator for you. I think it's more about, as an entrepreneur, making sure that you're clear on what your objectives are, and that is going to help you along the journey. Whether I know that came from an accelerator or not kind of is irrelevant. It just means that you might come to me with a more finished product, right? A more complete pitch and a better story. And sometimes those are great programs to help you work through some of the thorny issues that you're struggling to get through. So I would just tell people to go out and find the ones that are germane for their business if they exist. I don't think it's a bad thing.
So when it comes to digital health solutions, are there any key milestones that you would recommend startups achieve before getting into funding conversations with investors?
I mean, I think a lot of that depends on what type of investment you're looking for. If you're really early on and you're going to look for seed, there are a lot more questions than answers at that phase, right? You're raising a relatively small amount of money with the idea of trying to test out some of your hypotheses. So I think you need to be clear, not around I think you need to be clear about what the milestones are that you'd like to achieve with the capital. I always ask entrepreneurs, I'm like, okay, you get this money, what's success look like for you in 12 months? Like, tell me what you're going to do with the money and what would make you happy or not happy. And so I think that's probably the most important thing, is to really have a clear picture of what the objectives are and the timing for that, and how that will lead to appetite for the next round of financing, right? Like, here are the core operating metrics that we know that an investor will want at the next stage. For us, we're sort of later seed and early Series A. For us, we're looking for better commercial indicators, right? And so, do we have commercial proof points that indicate that people care enough to pay money to solve this problem with this solution? And that's challenging for sure.
I think apart from commercial proof points, one of the metrics that you discussed was also health outcomes. So when it comes to health outcomes, from an investor perspective, how rigorous should startups be? Is it just patient-reported data? Okay, what volume of data would you consider? Any rules on that? Any recommendations on that?
More is better.
Okay.
I think the short answer is the role of data, whether it be from clinical trials or patient-reported outcomes or other performance metrics, are getting more and more important right now as the cycle gets more disciplined, right? As investors get more disciplined, they want to see more of the financial ROI data and more of the clinical outcome data. And so the more, the better. Certainly PROMs are a piece of it, right? But I think clinical trials are also a piece of it. And I think measure is sort of, what we tell people. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons that's really important is a big struggle for lots of digital health companies of what I call the attribution problem, which is in this market, so even with the downturn, companies are using multiple solutions at the same time, right? And so they're not buy one, test it, buy another, test it, buy another. It's not serial, it's parallel. And so what happens is things may get better. Costs may go down, outcomes may get better, but it's very hard to create the causal link between your company and that result. And success has many parents. And so when something gets better, everybody who is there raises their hand and says it was me. And so you need to be really deliberate when you go in about defining what's success and connecting the dots between your solution and what the outcome is. And if you can't get the buyer, the customer, to agree up front on what success looks like, I'd caution you about whether that's a customer you really want early on. Like, it's very important before you start rolling out a product to understand, where's the there, right? Because otherwise you're going to get to the end of that project and you're not going to have any idea whether or not you move the needle.
Interesting. Personally, working within pharma and also working with a lot of clients, there's so many pharma partnerships that we see in the industry, right? Not a lot of successes. The industry is evolving, so many other reasons to it. It's complicated to say the least. As an investor, how do you see these partnerships currently? What do you think that they add value to a startup's valuation? What do you see them progressing into?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's been a lot of hope without a lot of delivery over the last number of years in the pharma market. I think the models are evolving. I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to pharma because I like to remind myself all the time that these companies make a lot of money selling drugs. And while a lot of them talk a lot about having they have very extensive digital health strategies, it's not entirely clear how that relates back to sort of the core business that runs their financials. So that said, they are increasingly becoming customers for our companies, and so I do think that it's evolving. Right now, the initial we're going to have digital therapeutics be a standalone line of business for a pharma company. That's not played out, right? What seems to be more likely to play out right now are some of these partnerships, some of these joint efforts to create closer ties between pharma and their customers and consumers, to drive adherence, to create patient support systems that allow the ultimate users, us who are taking their medications, to make sure that we're benefiting as much as possible from the therapeutics. But I think the models are still evolving, it's hard for them to forget. It's hard for them to sort of forget their old ways. And that supply chain, I've seen much more work on the digital health side in pharma that's been successful around sort of the picks and shovels than the consumer side of it, right? So remote clinical trials, perfect application, right? AI-driven drug discovery, great application. So some of those businesses, hugely valuable for pharma, and that's where I think a lot of them are going now. Early on, I think they thought they were going to have different types of therapeutics that leverage digital health, and then that would be a big revenue line item for them. I think that hasn't played out yet, and it may not for quite a while.
So when a startup says that they have ongoing discussions for a pharma partnership or in any industry partnerships, or they are in a partnership, what are some of the questions that you as an investor would ask to evaluate, is the partnership worthy of considering for evaluation, for example?
I mean, look, you have to understand, what are the metrics of success? What are you trying to achieve from the partnership? Is it revenue? Is it clinical trial data? Is it product development? I think trying to understand the why is always the most important part there, because these are big companies that are slow moving, that take a lot of time and energy and resources to manage. And so you just have to be really clear on what are the deliverables that you're hoping to get from those relationships. Just coming in and telling me you've got that relationship isn't meaningful unless you can demonstrate that those are paying customers and that's your core target market. So I think I'm more interested in sort of the why and what's it delivering, and how much resource and time and money does it take to manage those relationships.
There's a question from the audience on why should pharma invest in digital health solutions? I think you covered a little around that. Any further comments to add?
I mean, it's a good question. I think their perspective is, I think, threefold. One is around drug discovery. And so can it accelerate the pace of drug discovery and reduce costs? Two is clinical trials. Again, that's about better data, lower cost, and more. And interestingly enough, one of the things that's really showed up lately is a real need and appetite for diverse patient panels for clinical trials. It's a huge problem that we have a very homogeneous, most clinical trials have a very homogeneous patient pool. And then I would say the last thing is a lot of them are really trying to learn. They don't know a lot about their customers. And customers, I mean us, right? They know that I have atopic dermatitis and I take Dupixent. And this is a $30,000 to $50,000 a year drug. And they like me because that's a profitable drug, right? But they don't know a lot about me as a consumer, and they want to. And so I think they're spending time also trying to understand what their patient journey is, and what are the other things that they can plug in to that journey to make sure the patient maximizes the benefit from the drug, stays adherent to it, doesn't switch to their competitor, doesn't drop it all, entirely. So I think those are the three areas that we're seeing people spend time in pharma.
Interesting. So even for a partnership, I think it's going back to the basics. I mean, how are you defining the partnership? What are you trying to succeed with? One last question. I know I can go on this topic quite a lot, but one last question is, when it comes to these partnerships, do you see a clear role? For example, customer acquisition, to your point about pharma may not understand you as a customer. They may be very good with the product. They may be very good with a lot of the science. Do you see a clear role where a startup can bring in those trends versus pharma can bring in the science and the product and the clinical trials and the efficacies? Is there a clear role, or is it more partnership, subjective to partnerships?
I mean, I think the role is innovation, honestly, across the board. Is that, big companies, not just pharma, but almost all the industry stakeholders move slowly, right? And they're highly complex organizations, highly political, highly bureaucratic, and they don't excel typically at innovation outside of their core businesses. And so I think the real question is, they have strategic ideas of how they want to leverage these solutions, but they really do need entrepreneurs like those on the call today to come in there with some of the innovative solutions and help them think through that. So I think that's the role. And, I do see a win-win there if you can create products and services that address some of their strategic needs, because I think they struggle to do it internally.
So stepping back and going more into the funding side of things, I think one of the questions that we see from the audience is, did I see a range of 3 to 10x on the CAC in slide deck? What is seen as a good multiple on advertising spend on a DTC, DTX offering?
It's a very specific question. I think we look at it a little more holistically, which is sort of minimum of 3x CAC to LTV, ideal 5 or higher, and that there are a lot of different components that go into CAC. That one of them is spend around advertising, but like it's a bigger calculation, right? You have to understand direct costs, labor, indirect costs, that go into your acquisition costs. One of the things I see people doing is not getting that calculation right. And so you end up with sort of these artificially low CACs because they might just look at the ad spend, but not the labor and expense behind your customer acquisition team or something like that. So I think it's a more holistic metric. If you spend less on labor and more on advertising, then, and the CAC still works out to 3 to 5x, you're probably in good shape. The other equation is also going to be LTV. So it's both, right? I think you want to see high LTV and low CAC, and that ratio matters. Again, this is why I say the metrics do matter. Like, people really need to look hard at these metrics and think strategically about a lot of A/B testing, Like,
Mhm.
I was talking to someone the other day who was telling me that any day of the week, like that Google has something like 100 homepages, and they're A/B testing everything under the sun. And obviously, most startups don't have the resources to do that. But the beauty of the internet is your ability to A/B test quickly, right? And you can gather data and iterate. We don't do a lot of direct to consumer work because we're not consumer experts, but a lot of our companies use that as a test bed, right? If you have to wait to get data from a payer, it takes forever, right? You could try something with a direct to consumer and in less than a week have some pretty good data on 100 people. And so I do encourage people, that's a very cost-effective way to test and iterate.
Interesting. Customer acquisition or outcomes, what do you think is more important to see from a product to make it investable?
Both. There's no either or on these. I mean, I think it's hard to show outcomes. And so it takes a while. And you don't have to have CAC perfect. What you have to do is be able to show that you're learning and iterating and it's getting better over time, right?
Mhm.
Nobody's at unit economics look great at the beginning. The question is sort of what's the path to better unit economics, to higher gross margin, to profitability. It takes a while to gather outcomes data. And so I think what's important is for people to develop KPIs that can act as proxies for outcomes early on,
Okay.
right? So some of the, so you may not be able to get, so for example, you can get patient-reported outcomes or some standard measures for almost every condition. Those are relatively easy to gather, right? But data from a clinical trial could take you a year or two. And so again, it's important, I think, to leverage some of the tools out there to get as much data as early as possible that shows improvement, and make sure the N is not insignificant, right? So, the data isn't that meaningful if you come and tell me that I did a study with 5 people, or 10 people, try to get 100, a few hundred, something that's more statistically significant.
It's almost progressive, right? You get the customer acquisition and hopefully with a critical mass, you also see outcomes. So that's why both matter probably.
I think what really matters is can you get utilization, right? Like if you can't get utilization, then LTV is 0 or next to 0, and the whole thing doesn't matter. And so the question really is, are you solving a problem that's, again, go back to the basics, are you solving a problem that somebody cares about, right? And so I think one of my biggest questions when I think about companies I see, when I think about the industry, one of we say what keeps me up at night is I don't think we've gotten close to figuring out what durable behavioral change looks like. Like, even though we've been at this for 5 or 10 years, like we really don't know how many of the solutions out there have actually created sustained behavioral change. And I'm not talking about like weeks or months, I'm talking about years, right? Like we don't have a lot of longitudinal data on these solutions yet to really understand, what the long-term impact is. And the reason I say that is because, as I said in the original part of my slides was like, trend is still going up. In the US this year, it's going to go up, total cost about 6.5%, right? Diabetes is still going up.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not like we've solved for these things. Like we're bailing water out of a leaky boat, we're helping people with these chronic diseases, but meanwhile, every day more people are getting diagnosed with the chronic disease than those that we're helping. And so, I think there are just a lot of questions around how do we create longitudinal change that really drives better outcomes and reduce costs. Which is why it's really important for us to keep creating companies and starting and building product and trying to solve for these hard things.
On that point, there's a question from the audience on, there are so many digital therapeutics companies that have come on the market. Market probably cannot sustain these many DTX companies. How do you think the market will evolve?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think it goes back to outcomes. I think what we're going to see is that, as I say, Darwin shows up in these market cycles, right? It takes care of survival of the fittest, and those companies that don't have strong teams with good stories to tell and good outcome data, tend to go by the wayside, or they get merged with others. So I think there's going to be some attrition. There are going to be a lot of companies that fail. I think there are going to be some opportunistic sort of aggregation. We're already seeing that. We're already doing some of it ourselves, looking for assets that could be complementary to our portfolio companies. So sort of try and get the 1 + 1 = 3 equation to work. But I think the ones, especially ones that are really point solution driven, that are narrow in scope, are going to struggle unless they get sort of absorbed by a broader platform. And I think also it's important to know that there's still, there are not a lot of great success stories on DTX yet. There just aren't, right? And there's even tons of ambiguity around what a DTX is and whether it's prescribed or not prescribed, and who pays for it and how do you get it paid. And so I think there's still a lot of questions around it. And then, by the way, I was having this discussion the other day with someone. It's like, that the consumer has no idea what DTX means, right? Like if their doctor said, go do this thing, like they don't know what that means. And so one of the biggest barriers is provider uptake, is provider education, helping them understand how these tools get integrated into the clinical workflow. And let me tell you something, changing provider behavior is really, really hard. And so, and I know a lot of these companies are spending a lot of time sort of with clinicians trying to bridge that gap. But I think until it becomes sort of part of the standard clinical workflow, it's challenging for these products to get a lot of lift. So I do think there's going to be a shakeout.
Interesting. I completely agree. I think HCP adoption is one of the key areas. But to that point, I think integration is yet fully to happen. So still in that evolution phase where integration has to happen, education has to happen, and then probably adoption at scale. There's a question about medical device companies, Robert. How can software as medical device companies become more attractive for VCs? It seems many times that it is a risky or headache investment. Is that true?
Again, I think this is one of those solutions that's evolving, right? And I don't think there's a great understanding in the marketplace about, what these business models look like, what the go-to-market strategies look like, and there are not a lot of success stories yet that you can point at because it's so young. So I go back to the original question, which is, again, that's the how. The question, it goes back to the why, right? So, I wouldn't get overly obsessed with the fact that it's a software as a medical device. Is this a novel way to solve a big problem and demonstrate positive clinical outcomes and reduce costs? It's a means to an end. And that's how I tend to look at it and say, okay, well, there are a lot of different ways to solve for this problem. Maybe these are the traditional clinical ways, maybe they're digital ways, maybe there's software medical device, maybe they're DTX, I don't know. But I think the question is why is this better, different, compelling compared to other ways to solve for this problem? Because I think it's just a how, and it may be a better how. And I would focus on telling that story as opposed to getting sort of tied up in the nomenclature, which is, I think, how people tend to, get caught up in acronyms. And I'm not focused on the acronyms. I'm focused on solutions that solve real problems. And so that may seem simplistic, but again, it's back to the basics. It's like, you might be, people with those solutions may be spending too much time focused on the definitions and not enough time focused on why they're doing what they're doing and who cares.
Interesting. Always back to the basics. That's easy and good to remember as well. So on the retention rate, there's a question on B2B2C. What percentage would you consider is a good enough monthly retention rate, engagement rate? Any recommendations?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think there are a few factors to consider. One is sort of what's the program, right? Some have a program where they look at and say, like, we want to engage users, put them on the platform, and like they're supposed to stay on it forever, ideally. There are a lot of other programs which is like, this is a 12-week program. So our goal is for them to complete a 12-week program focused on pick something, substance abuse, right? And so I think first the metric is, what's the goal?
Okay.
And to start the beginning, like total enrollment from a population will depend on the channel. So if you've gotten to 30% of a population and activated, enrolled, you're best in class.
So
And that's just getting them activated and enrolled. If you have 6-month fallout of 50%, that seems to be pretty typical these days. But again, it really depends on sort of, where's the ending point. From our perspective, if you come to us and tell us that you have a 12-week program, I want to see that you're keeping 80% of the people, getting them to complete the program, or some very high number, right? So if you spend all this money activating your users on a 12-week program and only 30% of them complete the program, that's really bad, right? That tells me that it's not compelling, it's not meeting the needs of the consumer, it's not a great experience for the user, something is not right.
how about chronic diseases, which are more lifestyle diseases, say diabetes, for example? How long should a startup be able to engage someone in diabetes?
We've seen best in class at about 2 years.
Okay.
So I think it depends. It always depends. But yeah, we've seen some pretty good retention on some of the chronic disease platforms, and they've gotten better over time. I think part of the reason, one, is it's a very well understood condition, and two, it's one of the big three. And so the big three are diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and mental health. And those are among the earliest solutions that came, cardiometabolic, really. Those are the first solutions that sort of got all the attention 3, 4, 5 years ago. And so there's the most amount of data and the most amount of patients that have been activated on those solutions. Some of the other ones, the other conditions that are much newer, we don't have that kind of data on them yet.
Interesting. So from an investor's perspective, how much do you focus on inclusive design of the product, service, or experience from the company?
Yeah, I saw that was Adamika who asked that. The short answer is not enough. I think as an industry, not enough. I would say there's been a lot of attention shown on that over the last year or two, driven in part by COVID. As a firm, we have one of our 5 investment lanes is what we call vulnerable populations, which is how do we think about those less advantaged who have issues around affordability and access to care, and that could be rural health, it could be multi-ethnic populations, it could be inner city, it could be non-clinical social determinants, those types of things. And so I think it's very important. Some of the biggest costs and biggest needs are in the underserved populations of our country, at least in the US. And I don't want to make this too US a focused panel, but Adam, you can correct me. Last I heard, I think there's north of 70 million people on Medicaid here. And so that's a staggering number, totally staggering number. And they have such basic needs that aren't being met that it's great to talk about solving for all these big complex problems, but there are a lot of really basic needs that need to be met and aren't being met. So I think it's hugely important. And that goes back to like the clinical trial component I made before. Like we're hearing from pharma, they're getting a lot of pressure to have more diverse clinical trials. Like that's a pretty basic, simple thing that we should be able to address. And yet every pharma I've talked about, 8 of the big pharmas, they're all struggling with that.
On the investment, there is a question on, can you help us understand the balance between having a big vision or story that addresses hard problems and demonstrating an understanding of the real pace of healthcare when seeking investment? It seems like investors are demanding very aggressive timelines, milestones, and financial projections for a 12 to 18-month race. Can you help us understand how investors see this?
Yeah, I mean, look, building companies in healthcare is really hard. It's a really complex supply chain, an ecosystem. It's regulated, it's bureaucratic, a lot of different competing stakeholders and a lot of misaligned incentives. And so, at least having been in the market for 30 years, we as investors were pretty practical about what it takes to build businesses here. And I don't think we look for solutions in 12 to 18 months. What we do look for is how do we create concrete milestones that demonstrate progress, right, against core objectives. And so what are the 3 to 5 key KPIs that you want to track? and can you demonstrate significant progress against them in 18 months? And part of that, I think, is also core component of your go-to-market strategy, right? If you're going to go to market through an employer who is a relatively fast adopter, that has different implications. If you're starting out of the gate going after big, single payer systems in Europe or big health insurers in the US, like it's a really long road. They want a lot of clinical data. It takes a long time to navigate these complex organizations. And you probably won't be able to demonstrate a lot of progress in 12 months. It could take you 12 months just to get a contract signed for a pilot with one of these guys. So I think if you want to show progress and you want to, demonstrate momentum with an investor, I think you need to think strategically about, what are the ways you can do that and be scrappy, and think about your go-to-market strategies. Think about who your strategic partners could be that could help you get to market faster. That's where like some of these, there's an accelerator in Philadelphia called Dream It that we've done some work with that does road shows for their cohorts to customers, like dozens of customers and dozens of investors. And they're a good way to accelerate access to the market, both from a money and from a customer perspective. And so you have to be a little bit innovative around how you're going to market in healthcare and able to show traction. So there's no magic answer to that question at all. But I do think that the ability to get answer to those questions within a given time frame is directly correlated with how well you are able to articulate the problem, how quickly you can demonstrate ROI. So like if it takes you 3 years to demonstrate ROI, it's going to be really hard. So then you got to reimagine your product and say, how do I demonstrate ROI more quickly?
Interesting. There's a question on average revenue per user. There's a significant variation in average revenue per user between countries and geographies. What range do you think the average revenue per user will land up in for differentiated digital therapeutics?
Yeah, I'll let you know when I figure it out. It's all over the map. I've been in Europe 5 times in the last couple of months and talked to a lot of players there and see what's going on. It's really all over the map. And I think some of it depends on who's the payer, right? So if you're in Germany under DIGA and getting reimbursed under their model, it looks very different than, the NHS in the UK, which pays very little for most of their interventions. If they're in the US, it depends on if it's the employer or a traditional commercial payer or Medicaid, Medicare. And so I think a lot of it depends on sort of geography and go-to-market strategy. We haven't settled yet on a standard number. Ideally, I think it also depends on sort of what's the cost of the condition and cost of the alternatives. And so it's not possible to do it in a vacuum, right? So we have a company that focuses on chronic skin conditions. And so we know that for psoriasis patients who take biologics, they spend about 50 grand in the US on a biologic per year, right? So we could still come in and our RPU is 5 grand a year, and we would be a massive savings for that particular user and whoever has risk for the cost of care. You go to somebody else for their total cost of care in a given year is much lower, then that's going to drive a much lower RPU. So I know that's not a great answer, but there's no real standard rule of thumb. I think it's a function of the economics of the given condition in a given country and go to market.
So earlier we were talking about integrating platforms into workflows. So there's a question around, do you see consolidation of platforms? Hundreds of digital therapeutic companies with platforms for different indications, employers, health systems want one unified platform. What are your views? Do you see that happening?
I hope it happens. How about that? It has to. It has to. It's interesting. One of the things I've been hearing lately is that some of that's already happening. And what's happening is that companies are aggregating the solutions, but there's not good integration. like it's a horrible user experience because they're completely different products. And so they don't have single sign-on, they don't have common user interfaces, they don't have, if somebody needs to use more than one of them, there's no good way to track them together. I mean, so there are a lot of sort of the basic blocking and tackling around consolidation and aggregation that's going to have to be figured out. I know that we get this request from customers all the time about, you froze there, Joe. We get this question all the time about who out there is going to be the aggregation point. And there's no clear answer yet.
We've lost
Sorry,
Joe
I think
for a
I
moment.
had like a small.
You're back with us, Joe. Your video is just a bit lagging. Okay, well, maybe when Joe just gets her camera and audio back up, Robert, we can take maybe one or two last of the questions that have come in from the Q&A. So any of them that we just haven't answered or touched on yet?
Let me take a quick look.
Sorry, Robert. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, you're back.
Yeah, you're back.
Sorry for leaving you alone for a minute there. I think we're at the end of time. A couple of questions to discuss in the end, Robert, is what are some of the therapy areas or that you see that have most growth potential or investment potential in the next 2 to 5 years?
So it's interesting. I think I view it both horizontally and vertically, right? Horizontally, I like to say I feel like we're just coming out of what I call the digitization phase for the most part, which is taking outside of DTX, which is taking sort of traditional healthcare therapeutic pathways and just putting them online, right? Like CBT and mental health. And that's sort of step one in moving people to sort of tech-enabled solutions. What I'd like to see is sort of moving from digitization to transformation. And transformation is where you start seeing AI and ML and some more automation. It's where you're seeing DTX. It's where you're seeing solutions that don't just exacerbate supply demand on the labor side. So I feel like we're sort of tailing off on version 1.0 of digital health and moving into 2.0, and that we need a step function on the innovation side to address sort of some of the ongoing systemic problems in the market. I think, vertically, there's no magic. We still have these big problems. We just made we started Livongo. It was a great win for us, right? We said we're never going to do another diabetes company, and we just did one about a month ago. And so, and the reason we did is because we haven't solved the problem. So I think the big ones are mental health, same thing. We've done a couple more of those, and it's an epidemic. I'm spending time now looking at solutions focused on aging. Solutions, we have so many people getting to the aging part. We got to figure out how do we get them to age better, age in place, spend less money at the end of life. I keep looking for solutions in neuro and focused on cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, that area. It's early days, but I really hope we can find things there. We're looking at other conditions that are expensive. Stroke, what else lately? Take any chronic disease and we have it in spades. And we have it, it's not like we've solved them, even though there are 50 companies addressing each of the chronic conditions. So I'm still really bullish.
That's great. Okay, as we reach the end of the discussion, we have 2 more minutes. There's a question about how someone can get in touch with 7Wire Ventures. Fairly difficult from outside the US to find recommendations to reach you.
Well, you can always go through HealthXL. they know where to find me. And as I said, I'm usually in Europe at least 4 to 6 times a year, and so happy to always connect if I'm somewhere in town there. But yeah, Joe and Eve can share contact info.
Thanks, Robert. I think the topic can go on for so much longer because the topic is so much of interest to our audience today. But I think we're at the end of time. Thank you so much for joining us and all the valuable insights. Thank you.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks very much for the time. Good to see everybody.